Hi everyone, today I am here with a short summary of A Triumph of Surgery from Class 10, Lesson number 1 from Supplementary Reader Footprint Without Feet. Triumph of Surgery has three main characters, Tricky, Mrs. Pumphrey and Dr. James Harriet. Tricky is a dog. He's hugely fat. His eyes are red and rheumy. That means watery. He's like a blotted sausage with a leg at each corner. He's over-pampered by his rich mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. He has a big wardrobe of overcoats and raincoat and all types of coats for weather. He's being overfed by Mrs. Pumphrey as she believes that he is suffering from malnutrition. And that is why, because he looks listless and without energy, she keeps feeding him with cod liver oil, malt, a bowl of Horlicks, cream cakes, chocolates in between meals. But Tricky's greatest fault is his greed. He can tackle food at any time of the day. He never refuses food, and that is why he has become hugely fat. One day, because he eats too much, he falls ill. He gets bouts of vomiting and he stops eating anything. At that time, Dr. Harriet, he comes to his rescue. He's taken by Dr. Harriet to his clinic or surgery for a fortnight. That means a period of 14 days, 2 weeks. There at the surgery, he was being treated by Dr. Harriet and he had the best time of his life. He played with other dogs. He got involved in their friendly scrimmages and he was enjoying himself. At the end of that fortnight, he becomes a muscular dog, a lithe muscular dog, and he returns home safely to his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey, she's a rich and resourceful woman. She loves her dog a lot, but she's an over-pampering mistress. She cannot refuse food to Tricky, and she treats Tricky as if Tricky is her own son. And she's blind in this dog's love. Because of excess food and no exercise given to Tricky, Tricky falls ill. And when he falls ill, Mrs. Pumphrey is distraught. She's devastated. She calls Dr. James Harriet, who is a veterinary surgeon, and when James Harriet, he informs Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky needs to be hospitalized, she almost swoons. That means she's on the verge of fainting. And she even wails and cries and worries about Tricky's cushions, bowls, coats and other things. She would worry a lot about Tricky when he was in the surgery, and she would call dozens of times to ask whether everything is going all right or not. And when she comes to know that Tricky is recovering or he's convalescing, she starts sending 24 of egg at a time in order to improve Tricky's constitution. She even sends bottles of wine to enrich his blood. She sends bottle of brandy also to put a final touch. And when Dr. Harriet calls Mrs. Pumphrey to take Tricky home, she comes very quickly. She is worried, she's trembling, and she's nervous also because she feels as if something has happened to Tricky. And when she sees Tricky, she's very happy. She had tears in her eyes and she thanks Dr. Harriet and she calls it a triumph of surgery. So according to her, it's a victory of surgery. Surgery can be operation. As per Mrs. Pumphrey, Dr. Harriet has done some kind of operation and that is why Tricky has got well. So she believes it's a triumph, a victory of surgery, or it can be clinic also, because in the lesson, his clinic is called a surgery. So here she calls it a victory of the treatment done by Dr. Harriet, and she's thankful, she's full of tears as she leaves the surgery. Now Dr. James Harriet He is a very clever, intelligent veterinary surgeon, that means animal surgeon. When he looks at Tricky, he's shocked to see his appearance. He's worried. He warns Mrs. Pumphrey to control Tricky's diet and give him exercise. And Mrs. Pumphrey, she informs Dr. Harriet that there is no ring throwing lately because the gardener is not well, and she cannot refuse food to Tricky as she feels he's getting listless and he's suffering from malnutrition, and it is very difficult for Mrs. Pumphrey to control Tricky's diet and say no to him. But when she's warned, she goes with a determination that she would improve and she would try to put this into practice. But when Tricky falls ill, Mr. James Harriet, he takes a strict decision that he's going to take Tricky to his surgery for a fortnight. So he's very firm at his decision, he's clear-headed, and he takes Tricky to his surgery or clinic. Now at the surgery, he starts Tricky's treatment. For 2 days, Tricky is not given any kind of food, but he's given plenty of water. On the 3rd day, he shows some interest in the outside and he starts to whimper, and he's allowed to go out with other dogs. He's also shown on the 3rd day how other dogs fight for their food and how they eat food. And on the 4th day, he is given food along with other dogs, and he's not given any kind of special treatment, and there was no medicinal treatment also given to Tricky. But he was kept on a strict diet and he was also allowed to go out with other dogs. So he became an accepted member of the gang of those dogs. He was the only silky object in that shaggy crew. James Harriet, he's tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest because he was getting a lot of things sent by Mrs. Pumphrey. Mr. Harriet and his partners at the clinic, at the surgery, they were enjoying all the things sent by Mrs. Pumphrey, whether it is eggs, bottle of wine, brandy. And Mr. Harriet, he says that those were the days of deep content, satisfaction, when they would start their day with 2 extra eggs. They would have glasses of wine during lunch, and they would enjoy brandy around the fire during or after dinner. So he was tempted to keep Tricky, but he knows that Mrs. Pumphrey is suffering, and he decides to return Tricky after a fortnight. So he calls Mrs. Pumphrey, she comes, and Tricky is returned back to his mistress. We come to know that James Harriet is very tactful. He knows how to treat the dog and how to handle Mrs. Pumphrey. He is very wise and intelligent. He uses a commonsensical approach in dealing with Tricky, but he is dishonest also. He doesn't tell Mrs. Pumphrey that he and his partners were enjoying all the eggs and wine and brandy which was actually sent for Tricky. In this way, James Harriet, he treats Tricky, and Tricky is sent back to the owner. Now from the lesson, we come to know that excess of anything is bad, whether it is food or any other thing. If you give anything in excess, it is harmful for us. And here food is given in excess, and that is actually harmful for Tricky. We also learn from this story that we need to have a commonsensical approach towards things. Medicine is not always the solution. So without performing a surgery, he treats Tricky. So it's a triumph, it's a victory of the surgery or the treatment or the clinic which is run by Dr. Harriet. I hope you like the explanation. Please like, share and subscribe, and thank you so much for your love and support.